Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be looking at, I think, one of the best producers, engineers, mixers of our era, a guy named Nigel Godrich. Nigel is probably most famous for his work with Radiohead, but also he's worked with Beck. He's worked with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He's done records for U2, Natalie Imbruglia, REM, a whole bunch of major artists. But I think most people who really know him for his work with Radiohead. Once they started working with him as a producer, they never stopped. And all of their records since the first one he produced for them have been produced by Nigel Godrich. He's also produced, half of Beck's records or thereabouts, some really creative music production style on them. And we'll listen to those artists and a bunch of others comparing mixes that Nigel has done with mixes from other mixers, where possible, on the same album with the same engineer and all that stuff. With Nigel, it's a little bit trickier than some of the past producers and engineers who have been in this series, because Nigel is often both producing and mixing all of the songs on any album he touches. There are some exceptions to that, though, and I have a handful of albums pulled up here where we'll be able to see and hear in real time together how his mixes stack up to other mixers who have been on the same record with him. So I've got a whole big Spotify playlist here that I've pulled up, and you guys can listen to it after this presentation as well. I'll have that in the show notes for you down below. But while I'm getting everything up on screen here, the last couple things I want to say about him is that in listening to Nigel's work on a ton of great records, we'll get a sense for how music production and mixing has evolved from the 1990s until today. Because if you listen to the first Radiohead records, they sound a lot different than the last Radiohead records. Particularly in rock and alternative genres, there are huge differences in overall aesthetic, production style, production techniques, mix aesthetic, mix techniques, all of that stuff from the early 90s to now when I'm recording this in 2025. And we'll touch on what some of those big changes are. And Nigel is honestly the forefront of a lot of those changes, really pushing things forward. A lot of the first mixes I heard from Nigel, when I heard them back in the 90s and the early 2000s, I was like, wow, nobody is making records that sound like this, but he is. And today, so many records kind of bear the stamp of having been influenced heavily by his work. All right, without much further ado, I'd like to get right into it. The only thing I've got to do before we get all the way into it is the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. How do you sponsor this podcast? You can sponsor it yourself by clicking the like button, clicking subscribe, hit the notifications bell, all that good stuff. It really does help spread the word about the podcast. But the best way to sponsor yourself, as always, is to check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, EQ Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs. They are guaranteed to change the way that you work forever, for the better, or your money back. They really dramatically change mixes. The before and afters that I've heard out of this thing are just astounding, and I want you to be one of them too. That's why it's got a 30-day money-back guarantee. Also, a quick shout out and thanks to Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right, now with all of that out of the way, let's get into listening to some tunes together. I'll make myself a little bit smaller on here, just so you know and understand how this playlist works. Going to move myself a little bit more to the side, get my headphones on so we can listen along to this together. In this playlist I've made, you'll be able to find that in the comments down below and in the description. There are a few things going on. Every odd numbered track is a track that has been mixed by Nigel Godrich, often produced by Nigel as well. Every even numbered track is a track that he did not mix. Where I can find them, they're from the same album, but with a different mixing engineer. So everything else is the same. So we'll get to see how his approach is in contrast to other mixers. And I got to tell you, when we get further down this playlist, we get to some of these Natalie Imbruglia records or REM records. It's almost, I would be embarrassed to be the other mixer on the album because of how much better Nigel's mixes are, in my humble opinion. Where that isn't possible, we also have some back-to-backs where we can hear some of his work compared to an album from the same artist right before or right after the one he did. So all these odd number ones are his mixes, all the even numbered ones are some other mixes. I've got one here from U2 from the early 2000s that'll give you a sense for just how dramatically different things can sound in a mix just by making different choices. And one of the big things you got to know about Nigel is I hope you would appreciate the approach on this episode, because we're not going to be talking a ton about specific microphones and specific compressors, because Nigel is on record as saying that stuff doesn't really matter. People obsess about the gear, but it's about what music sounds like and the choices that you make. And that's the big thing we're going to be focusing on, the choices that he makes. Now, where applicable, there's certain techniques that you can hear, certain approaches that you can hear, and I'll touch on them where possible. But these are going to be obvious things, like obvious approaches to reverb, panning, balance decisions, compression, limiting. And often you can use 90 different tools to do the same kind of thing that Nigel is doing. All right, without much further ado here, let's actually listen to some stuff. And I'm going to start you with Beck, because Beck is probably one of the artists I listened to the most as a teenager. Like probably Beck and Nirvana were probably my two biggest influences circa Justin, 13 through 16 age. And I want to play you the difference between what was, probably still is, I think, the best Beck record, Odelay, compared to the sound of the first one that Nigel Godrich produces for him, Mutations. So let's remind ourselves what Beck's big hit album, Odelay, sounds like with a little bit of the song, New Pollution. Really great track, great mix. This is the Dust Brothers, I think, producing and mixing this stuff. So we'll get that in our ear, and then we'll switch to his next album, Mutations, which is produced and mixed by Nigel, and we'll hear some huge differences in texture, in tone, and in choices. Here we go.
Cigarette on each arm. She's got the lily white cavity crazes. She's got a carburetor tied to the moon. Pink eyes looking to the fruit of the ages. She's alone in the new pollution. She's alone in the new pollution.
So that's New Pollution, great track off of Odelay. Here's his next record, Mutations, produced by Nigel Godrich. Totally different feeling record, but also totally different sounding record. So obviously going to be musical differences, but let's pay attention to some of the mix differences and tell me in the live chat, if you're here for the live premiere of this, or in the comments below, what are some of the biggest differences you hear on this next one that Nigel does?
Broken guitar and all the streets, the reek of tropical charms, the embassies, lying hideous shards where tourists snore and decay. And when they dance in a reptile blaze, you wear a mask, an equatorial haze into the past, a colonial maze where there's no more confetti to throw. You wouldn't know what to say to yourself. Love is a poverty you couldn't sell. Misery waits in big hotels to be addicted.
Again, great track. That's probably, honestly, the best track on that record. I don't think Mutations is as good of a record as Odelay is, but there are aspects of the production that are just brilliant. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is this is so much more technicolor and exaggerated hi-fi sounding than Odelay. Odelay has this somewhat kind of like brown, mid-rangey quality compared to, all of a sudden, we open out the stereo spectrum and there's more height, there's more depth, there's a lot more width going on. So some of the biggest things that stand out to me in making the difference between these tracks is, first of all, Nigel's approach to panning. And it is all over the place. One of the most common things you'll hear in Nigel Godrich records is he is not afraid of super hard panning. And this is one of the big recommendations I often give to mixers when they're trying to get more bold sounding mixes and they want wider sounding mixes, is think about things with a left, center, right frame of mind. And I remember reading an interview, I think it was with Beck himself, where he talked about working with Nigel on this record. I believe they were mixing it on an older console that just had assignment knobs. Like it didn't have actual pan knobs. It had assignment switches for left, right, or both. So your choices with panning were left, center, and right. And you hear that all over Mutations and all over Nigel's work. Now, this doesn't mean that every single sound you always pan should always be just left, center, or right. But honestly, if you want wide sounding mixes, it's often best to err on starting there. And then if it's too much, tuck it in a little bit. Rather than getting to that habit sometimes we get into of, oh, I want this to be a little bit to the left, and you pan it 15 degrees to the left, and it's like, oh, I think that's wider. No. Set that sucker out to 100, and then if you just can't get things to be balanced properly and to sit right at 100, then try tucking in to 90 or 85. And just flipping the script on that, instead of thinking about panning things out, think about starting with left, center, right, and then bringing things in slightly. The other big thing that you'll hear here is that the reverb follows the instrument in panning. Often, Nigel is using mono reverbs that are like attached to the sound and panned with the sound. It's almost a found sample, a way of working that he applies not only to sample-based music, and there's a lot of samples in Beck, but he applies it to rock productions like a band like Radiohead. This idea of you take a classical guitar, or you take an odd percussion instrument and you send it to a reverb, but rather that reverb just being a big shared reverb that's in the center, the reverb follows the instrument. So if you're panning that instrument 80 degrees out one side, that reverb also gets panned along with it. Now, in some cases, Nigel is probably doing this in an analog way where he's printing reverbs onto tracks. And then, of course, the instrument and reverb get panned together because it's right there on the same track. This would especially be the way he was working when he was working on tape machines. But that's something we can take into our approach. Now, an easy way to do that in the DAW is you can actually use reverbs as inserts. Now, one of the big pieces of advice a lot of folks will give you, myself included, is to have templates where you have reverb set up and you have a bunch of different reverbs that you can immediately bus out to. But with that said, when do you want to take this approach? It's okay to have a dedicated instrument with a dedicated reverb and for it to live right on the track. That can sometimes create some mixing headaches where if you want to change the wet-dry balance, you change the level of your dry signal as you're turning up the reverb. So you actually turn down the dry signal as you're turning up your reverb. So there's annoyances to working with inserts. It can also tax more CPU. If you find your computer often freezing up, it can be kind of annoying to have inserts for reverbs instead of sending to them. But if you have the processing power for it, or if you can freeze your tracks or print your tracks, this is absolutely an approach to take. Listen really quick to the panning on the song Tropicalia. See if you can figure out how many instruments you can identify as being panned, and listen for the reverb and tell me, is that reverb stereo in width or is it glued to the instrument? Here's the intro to Tropicalia again. So wide.
You're out of luck. You're singing funeral songs to the studs. They're anabolic and bronze. They seem to strut in their millennial fogs till they fall down and deflate. Are you a...
Right, so we've got a classical guitar and a percussion instrument panned hard right, and then we've got a different percussion instrument panned hard left, and when the horns come in, they're panned hard left. And the reverb on those horns, where is it?
Know what to say to yourself. Love is a poverty you couldn't sell. Misery waits in...
Actually, there end up being a duplicate of the horn, so their horns panned both hard right and hard left. It was just that very first note before I hit stop came in on hard left. But you can hear the reverb following those instruments, and you can hear, this is the other big thing, juxtaposition. When you want super wide mixes, it is not enough to just take one guitar part, play the same guitar part again with the same tone, and pan them hard left and hard right. That's not going to get you the widest sounds. If you want to get wider sounds, you can take the same guitar part, have two different amp tones, pan one left and one right, and now you have a wider sounding guitar. But if you want to go wider still, it's not just the tone that's different, it's the part that's different. When you have juxtaposing rhythms left and right, that is when you get true width, and that is what Nigel's not afraid of. Listen again to just the hard panning of percussion.
The wicked tropical charms, the embassies lie in hideous yards where tourists snore and decay. And when when they dance.
And part of what gives this track this kind of technicolor, larger than life kind of feeling to me is the depth that he has. Nigel's sounds are so punchy. He's using plenty of compression and limiting because he often mixes loud and louder and louder as he goes further in his career. But there is still attack on these instruments. They're not just completely sausaged. Like, he doesn't use compression and limiting in a way that completely kills the transient to the detriment of everything else. But also, there's this front to back depth where he has some sounds that he's not afraid of being almost glued to the front of the speakers. Like, they're really far forward, but then he uses some mono reverb on them, or at least reverb that follows the track on them, that just takes them a tiny bit back from being in the front of the speakers. This is very different than if you listen to the new Pollution, the way reverb and ambience is handled on it. Everything is further back in the mix. Listen to how much more forward things come when we listen to the Mutations record, the song Tropicalia, compared to the prior record, Odelay. So here's the prior record again, New Pollution. Listen to how much further back everything is in the mix, and how much more mid-rangey and less wide.
In a reptile
Whoops, wrong one.
wearing-
Here we go. Right, we do have guitar panned somewhat to our right, and we have a keyboard part panned somewhat to our left. That is fairly significant panning, but just listen to how much wider we go with Tropicalia and how much more forward things come.
Broken guitar and
All right, sweet. I want to play you a few more tracks that harp on this idea before we listen to some back-to-back ones, including a U2 song that Nigel mixed and that someone else mixed. And oh my goodness, do the two mixes sound extremely different. And we'll get a peek into Nigel's brain and what he's really listening for when we hear those. Make myself a tiny bit bigger on screen here. The next one that I want to play for you are not back-to-back records. I want to give you a sense for the evolution of music production. I'm going to play a little bit of Creep by Radiohead. Anyone know what year this is off the top of your head? Is it 93 or something? Yeah, Pablo Honey, the record, 1993. We'll listen to a little bit of Creep, and then we'll listen to some of either Kid A or In Rainbow's much later Radiohead stuff. And let me know what you think some of these differences are. So here's just a little bit of the beginning of Creep, one of the biggest songs from Radiohead. You probably heard it a million times. Has a lot of reverb on the vocal.
couldn't look you in the eye.
Delayed reverb, right?
You're just like an angel.
Very full bandwidth,
Skin
too.
makes me cry. You float like a feather.
Relatively uncompressed compared to modern records. And there's some productions that Nigel does that kind of bridge the gap between back then and today. But let's just listen to, I don't know, one of the earlier songs. Here's a song off of the first, off of In Rainbows from 2007. And just listen to how much record production has changed and how much different of an approach to mixing this is. Now, this intro to the song Reckoner by Radiohead is almost like two different songs playing at once. That's how crazily hard pan things are. And how crazily different the reverbs are on each of these different elements. right? So we have a shaker on our left-hand side, and we have a side stick snare on our left-hand side. And our right hand, we have this kind of ride cymbal. With a very muted attack. And then the vocal comes in. And you can hear how that vocal reverb has almost nothing to do with the reverb that's on the side stick snare. And you can hear that side stick snare reverb is not a stereo reverb that's throughout the entire mix. I mean, the things here are so disparate, it's almost a confusing sounding track, this one. And this is in ways much more experimental than what we were just hearing in Creep. Guitar is also on the left, just on the left. Now, there's so much more development that's going to happen in the production and the mix here, but in the interest of not getting copyright strikes all over the place, we'll go ahead and stop it there. But I recommend listening to more of Reckoner. Another song off of this that I often get people giving me as a reference are Weird Fishes and Jigsaw Falling Into Place. And I want to play a little bit of Weird Fishes because someone brought it up on a coaching call recently, and someone brought up Jigsaw Falling Into Place as a mastering reference recently. And let's just hear what's going on again with some of the signature panning choices that are going on and signature reverb choices that are going on. Here's a little bit of Weird Fishes. Centered, super dry drums. Now, this is a good place to start talking about tier theory. I have this idea that some of the most important changes that we make in our mix are level changes. Some of the most important decisions we make are decisions about what should be the most prominent thing in any given section. And you can really have just one or two elements that are in your A tier at any given time. These are the main characters of the mix. One or two elements that are meant to be the focal point, the kind of main attraction of this section. And then there's your B elements, your B tier elements that are meant to support and provide context to those A tier instruments and not get in their way. And then there's the C tier, which is the everything else. Now, the fewer elements you have, the more your elements can all just be an A or B tier, right? If you have a mix with 2 elements, it's easy to make them both big. If you have a mix with 90 elements, it's hard to make them all big at once. Sometimes people can fool us, though, into thinking that everything's big all at once when they're not, by having instruments take turns. And we hear that right here in the beginning. When this drum beat first drops, the kick is really big on it. But as soon as the guitar comes in, the guitar is allowed to mask the kick drum, but we still remember there being a big kick drum on this song because we heard a big kick drum for the first few bars in the beginning. And even though the kick drum isn't as big later on, we remember it as being big. So this idea of taking turns, I'm going to bring it up in every one of these episodes I do in the Mixmaster series because this is what they all do so well that some of us forget to do. Sometimes we think that it's our job as mixers to make everything sound equally loud at all times so we can hear whichever thing we want. No, it is your job to draw the attention of the listener to the things in the mix that will give them the most emotional impact, that will make them feel the groove of the mix the most, that will make them connect with the song the most. And that requires prioritizing, understanding the point of the song, what makes it work. And when we get to the U2 mix, man, we'll hear totally different takes on what's important in the song and how that radically transforms the mix. All right, let's listen to that with this in mind. Big kick in the beginning, then the guitar overtakes it, and listen to what's happening with panning in space as well. Big kick, right? Guitar and hi-hat. This is our A tier and possibly B tier. Snare drum is almost second thought. Well, the snare's big too. Okay, the point of the song is guitars and hi-hats. The kick's there, but we don't need to make it the biggest thing in the universe. And listen to the width, how wide that left guitar is. And how it has its own special ambience around it, very dark ambience around it. vocal comes in, it's going to be very interesting. A lot of reverb on the vocal.
In the deepest ocean,
Delayed reverb, right?
the bottom of the sea.
And there, that's real stereo delay reverb. It's probably stereo delay into a reverb.
They turn me.
Right, so again, a really unique reverb sound for the vocal that's totally separate and totally different than the reverb in the left pan guitar. Now, this is not to say this is appropriate for every single mix aesthetic and what you should do on every single album, but it is part of what gives Nigel his sound. And to me, it could be a reverb that's going into a delay, or more likely it could be a delay going into a reverb. And one thing you'll find with a lot of the reverbs that Nigel uses is that they're crafted reverbs. They're not super broadband. Like, he is taking off extreme bottom and in many cases extreme top to have a mid-rangey reverb that's focused in the right spot in the mid-range. So don't be afraid to use high cut and low cut filters on reverbs. I would imagine that many, if not most, of Nigel's reverbs are EQ'd on return. So those are a couple tastes, and you can see how far-flung different.
Why should I stay here?
This aesthetic is compared to Creep. And I want to go ahead because in the chorus, there's different, not the chorus, the second verse, there's different choices around vocals. The lead vocal actually becomes much drier. Instead, we have wet background vocals providing this kind of spaciousness around the vocal. I'll see if I can find that section, though it can be tricky on Spotify. Let me try to find it. Nope.
Why should I stay here?
Probably out here. No. All right. I don't have this open in Pro Tools with the song form marked, so I'm not going to annoy you going around trying to find it. But when you do listen to this on your own, listen to the second verse in this track and hear that special effect on the special reverb effect on the lead vocal goes away, and instead replaced with a really dry upfront vocal and then really wet background vocals behind it, which draws the main vocal forward, but gives you this incredible sense of space. So if you get to that second verse in the song, what you hear is a very forward vocal and then very kind of deep background backing vocals behind it with a ton of reverb. And Nigel is kind of doing that with the lead vocal that we've heard in the verse already, right? Where the reverb is so separated from the main vocal that the original main vocal can sound really upfront and really close, but really wet at the same time. Because Nigel uses his reverb almost like a shadow, something that is both completely detached from the original sound, usually through time, making them delayed, but also totally connected to the sound. Just like your shadow is at the same time totally detached from you. It's not part of your body. It's somewhere else. But it's also connected to you. It moves where you move. So I think that's the best analogy I can think of for describing Nigel's approach to reverb in the mix, is he uses it like a shadow. It is detached in location by using things like delay and potentially things like EQ, detached in location from the main sound, but it follows the main sound where it goes. There's some exceptions to that where this particular reverb on the vocal, it spreads out and it gets wide because there's stereo delay going into that reverb. But that stereo delay going into the reverb, again, detaches it from the main vocal. So we can have a vocal that feels both upfront with a whole bunch behind it at the same time. So he's a master, I think, of depth and width. All right, let's go back to our main playlist here. You can see I have a bunch of playlists here. Man, what else have we done this series? We've done Andy Wallace, we've done Michael Brower, we've done Steve Albini, we've done Chris Lord-Alge, we've done Chad Blake, we've done Serban Ganea. I could probably revisit any of these guys again and look at 20 different mixes that I didn't look at the first time. But if you have any requests for who we should do this treatment, this deep listening treatment to in the future, let me know. All right. Here's a kind of in-between. Karma Police is a mix that kind of bridges the gap where this is giving us hints to what records are going to sound like later into the 2000s. Because if you look at this album, extremely influential album, OK Computer, 1997, Karma Police, I think, better than almost anything, hints at what records are going to sound like 5 years into the future. So let's get a little bit of Creep in our ears once more, and then hear how much of a departure this middle ground of Karma Police is, And then we'll get into some even bigger differences. So here's a little bit of Creep again. That's not Creep. This is Creep. Much more band in a room, but with artificial reverb on it, right? So much less compression and limiting on the buses. Biggest thing in the mix is the snare right now, right?
When you were before,
It's about snare, vocal, and reverb. Dark reverb.
look you in the eye,
Almost muddy reverb, really wide.
you're just like an angel. Your skin makes me cry. You float like a feather.
Fine mix, but this one, I think, starts to take us in the direction of what records will sound like in the future from here. I mean, just the weight behind those drums and how punchy they are compared to drums that came before them. Now, those drums aren't a revelation now, but I will tell you, in 1997, when this song came out and I saw it on MTV and I heard the drums on, I was like, whoa, why don't drums sound like this on every song that's ever made? And in years' time, they would start to sound more and more like that on more and more songs. And this kind of drum sound is something that people are more likely to be able to achieve today. But it's a far cry from the type of drum mixing that you'd hear commonly on 90s alternative rock records. Now, there's so many different types of sounds in OK Computer. We could listen to so many songs on Paranoid Android, which is surprisingly bright sounding mix, but is another mix that people often reference even to this day. So much clarity loaded into that one, where this one is a little bit more bottom heavy and veiled. So great mixes on OK Computer. But I want to get into some more tracks that'll give us just a sense of how Nigel works with the same material that others have worked with. Here's an REM record where he mixed half the songs and someone else mixed half the songs. And I got to tell you, I would be embarrassed to be the other mixer on this record, especially listen to the song Day Sleeper and how much it just knocks out all the rest of the songs on the album for quality of mix. Similar thing going on with this Natalie Imbruglia record that he did mixes on. He mixed about half the record. And again, the odd number ones are him, the even numbered ones are somebody else. And in general, his mixes are just much more impressive, much more three-dimensional. Once we get into an artist like Warpaint here, this is more into the mid-2010s where he mixed two of the songs on the record. People had already been influenced by Nigel, and his mixes are much closer to the other mixers on this album. And I wouldn't say he blows them away because of how big his influence has been. But let's go over here to U2, and I will play for you. This album came out, let's double check the year on it. This is from an album, All That You Can't Leave Behind. The song Walk On. This one has 52 million plays on it. It's from the year 2000. And Nigel Godrich also did the single version of this same song. It's not on the album. You have to look it up on the single. But this one, many fewer plays because it wasn't part of the main album. But I think a cooler mix aesthetic, very different mix aesthetic. And you'll get to hear how much just simple volume choices and a few simple EQ choices can dramatically reimagine a song. So here's the beginning of Walk On, the album version, not mixed by Nigel Godrich. Here we go.
And love, it's not the easy thing.
I have to admit, I don't love Bono's talky vocals at the beginning. I think they're kind of cheesy, but get through them with me.
The only baggage that you can bring, love, not the easy thing. The only baggage you can bring is all that
To me, this sounds like someone way under EQ'd Bono's vocal. It sounds like he's swallowing an SM58, which I know that he is because that's actually how he sings in the studio. He has done almost all of his vocals in the studio into an SM58, and I feel like they left too much low end and low mid on it. It's kind of murky sounding vocal. And it's especially murky sounding because everything else in the mix is really thin, super thin snare sound, super thin, bright guitar sounds, and the cymbals really stand out on this.
And if the daylight feels like it's a long way and if your glass...
I honestly hate these cymbals in this mix, which I think that Nigel handles much better in his. I just feel like a 60-year-old boomer mixer who can't hear 10K anymore, and there's like, why is there so much high end in these cymbals? Man, I guess boomers are even older than 60 these days. Maybe that would be older Gen X. Now, with that in your ear, let's hear a little bit of Nigel's take on the same song. Very different. So for my taste, I think Nigel has done a much better job of handling the tom fills. They don't like poke out in this kind of a weird way. Much better job handling the cymbals, making sure that they don't poke out in this kind of weird way, and much better job making the vocal sound really impressive. He has a totally different idea of what's important in this mix. For him, it's like guitars and vocal are the main characters in this mix. There's a way in which it's a more unbalanced mix than the actual album mix, where it almost feels like at certain points, like the guitars come in and it's almost like guitars with a backing track. Like they are the point of the song. And I think he's picked two stars for this. The stars of this band, what makes it work is Edge's guitar playing is interesting, and that's part of the U2 sound. I mean, it's maybe not as interesting today as it was then, because again, Edge has been so influential on guitar players. There's whole like genres of bands that have erupted around Edge's style of guitar playing. You hear it in some more kind of modern stadium pop rock kind of stuff today. But he's like, wow, the key points of this band are how do we make Edge's guitar sound really big and impressive and interesting, and how do we make Bono's vocals sound really big and impressive and interesting? They're the main characters of the band. Whose names does everyone know from U2? Everyone knows the name Bono and everyone knows the name Edge. Unless you're a U2 fan, name either drummer, name either bass player. This is not to say they have a bad drummer and a bad bass player. Actually, if you listen to early U2, they actually kind of cook pretty well as a band, you know? And U2 fans are like, no, they're bassist and they're drummer, who I can name. If you're a U2 fan, you will absolutely know the name of the drummer and bass player. Feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to put it in the comments. They are notable people. But to the average music fan, what names do they know? It's Bono and Edge. And why is that? I mean, they're the most unique parts of the band. And he accents that so much. And just listen to how different this intro is handled. Listen to the first 15 seconds of each. Here's the original album version, not Nigel.
And love is not the easy thing, the only baggage that you can bring. Love is not the easy thing, the only baggage you can bring is all that you can't leave behind.
Versus. just listening to how panned that tambourine is. Big guitar parts. Now, I almost wish that there was a little bit more percussion emphasis in Nigel's mix than there is in this particular spot in the song. That said, I don't think he has as good source material to work with as on some of his own productions. Like if he produced this record himself, I think that there would be more sampled drum machine-y sounding drums here that he could make more impressive. But I think he's burying the drums on purpose, particularly when it comes to these later sections where I think he's handling these cymbals well that the original mix doesn't. Let's go a little further, like towards the chorus. Man, background vocals and guitars, biggest thing, followed by lead vocal. The drums are almost an afterthought in this section. It might not be the right choice to you, but he's making an extremely bold choice, and he does that kind of stuff all the time. Compared to the original, same section, right around here. So it's just a much kind of thinner, more piercing mix aesthetic overall, the original. This, I don't think, is the best Nigel Godrich mix that we're going to hear today. I think we've heard better ones already, and we're going to continue to hear better ones still. But again, I think that is a little bit maybe of a discomfort with the source material. I really like the kind of width and size he gets out of the guitars. I think he treats the vocals so much better. And I think if he could just bring some of his usual trademark punchiness into the drums on this, then it would be among his great mixes. Currently, I don't think it is. All right, let's get back to some of his other tracks, other artists. One of the things that I use often as a reference, one of my standard references for testing out stereo equipment, is this song, Paper Tiger from Beck. I want to hear a little bit of that. I also want to hear some more of Sea Change, and we'll compare that to some other Beck records. So here's a little bit of, not Beck's best record, I don't think, Midnight Vultures, his kind of funk record. We'll play a little bit of Deborah, and then we'll play a little bit of The Golden Age off Sea Change, which is a similar tempo. Here we go. A little bit of a song not mixed or produced by Nigel Godrich. Here we go. Let's just say one thing that is done very well in this mix. Some of you all aren't compressing your basses enough. This is an extremely compressed bass.
I met you at J.C. Penney. I think your name tag. I said Jenny. I could step to you.
Compared to a little bit of The Golden Age off of Sea Change, mixed by Nigel Godrich. I mean, already we're so much brighter, we're so much wider, and we're so much bigger. There's just more bottom and more top without sounding excessively scooped. So much width. That is such a Nigel Godrich-y sounding snare drum. My guess for this snare drum is mono overhead over a snare. Condenser, like mono condenser over a snare. It's very different than putting an SM57 on the snare drum. In fact, I know he often works that way. He went to a friend's studio of mine. I missed him there, but he came in. I think he was doing some demos for Here We Go Magic or something like that. I can't remember what band it was. Might have been Here We Go Magic. And my engineer friend there, Daniel James Schlett, he told me that Nigel came and he used 2 mics on the drum kit. One was a FET 47 inside the kick drum, like right up against the beater. And the other was a U67, just a Neumann condenser right over the snare drum pointing down into it. And that's the kind of snare sound that I'm hearing here. I mean, I could be wrong. There's other ways to get snares like this, but it's a thought. I mean, listen to the juxtaposition again in width. We have this glockenspiel-y, chimey thing over to our right, and then we have this really dark guitar over to our left. And again, with this chimey glockenspiel-y thing, it's simultaneously wet and dry at the same time. Like it's dry and up front. Like we can hear the attack of it so well. But then there's this reverb behind it, which doesn't have all of the top end that's in the glockenspiel. A big mistake a lot of us would make in mixing early on could be something like, hey, we'll take a glockenspiel and we'll just throw it into a reverb, and there's tons of high end coming back on the reverb. Here we have bright, punchy, well-controlled glockenspiel or other chimey instrument, and then a darker reverb behind it that allows it to sound bright and dry and up front because we're not hearing a ton of reverb on the highest parts, but it's given this space and ambience by having reverb with a little bit of a high cut on it. Let me back up so we can hear that chiming. Ooh, and there's another organ parroting that all the way over on the left-hand side. So we hear that chimey glockenspiel-y thing on the right, and then a reduced version of that same harmonic line playing on the far left with a totally different texture that's more mid-rangey. Listen for that. And then out of the end of that keyboard line on the left, our pedal steely, reverb-y sounding guitar kind of emerges. Man, that is such just a beautiful little moment in arrangement. Now, this is not all mixing. Part of this is arranging. Like he's arranging with the mix in mind. But that said, you can either look for these kinds of things that already exist in the arrangement, or you can add these things as the producer or as the artist. Listen for that one more time, the stereo doubling that's happening here. There's a juxtaposition between dark guitar on left, bright chimey sound on right, and then a double comes in on that bright chimey sound on the left and kind of overtakes the guitar. And then the guitar comes in, overtakes it. Listen for that one more time. And we have this C-tier element in there. It's almost, I don't know what to say other than like a flying saucer sound that's over to our left. Really dark, very muted top end. Don't be afraid to make certain elements in your mix sound really, really, really dark. Don't be afraid to make certain elements just like lose their top end completely to make other elements sound bright without having to load excessive amounts of high end into them. Listen for that one more time. The hard panned on your right-hand side, it's going to be this descending flying saucer sound. What would you call it? Let me know.
Put your hands on the wheel.
And there's that idea of a shadow reverb on the vocal again. Do you hear how separated it is from the vocal and how it doesn't have the same frequency balance as the vocal? A lot of us, when we want to put a reverb on a vocal, we're just like, add reverb to the vocal. No. That is not what's happening here. There's vocal and then wait. And now there's a disconnected reverb that's not only disconnected in time, but is disconnected in texture and frequency balance. It is not a full bandwidth reverb that sounds like a wet duplicate of his voice. No, it is EQ'd way differently than the rest of his voice. It does not have the same frequency balance as the rest of his voice. Listen again for this reverb as it comes in.
Put your hands on the wheel, let the golden age begin.
Man, there's so much delay on that reverb, we don't even hear the first word's reverb until like the third word, right? Really masterful.
The window down, feel the moonlight on your skin.
Now, there is some wetness on drums, on acoustic guitar, but the amount of wetness on them is absolutely dwarfed by the wetness on the vocal. So he's not afraid of having these big contrasts. And this is part of how you get depth. You have to choose which instruments are going to be in the foreground, which instruments are going to be in the middle ground, which instruments are going to be in the background. How do you want to stack those instruments? And if you're not asking those questions, you're never going to find the answers to them. And these are questions that, maybe not consciously, but at least subconsciously, Nigel Godrich is asking himself in these mixes. All right, let's do a little bit more Beck, and then we'll go into something different. Maybe we'll go into some more Radiohead. Maybe we'll go into some of this REM or something. Let's hear a little bit of Beck's most recent record, Hyperspace, in 2019. Apparently, some of the songs on this record, they were so unhappy with the mixes that they re-released the album again in 2020 with new mixes for like 4 or 5 of the songs. I'll play for you. I think this song, Star, I think is one of the songs that they ended up remixing. But they did not remix Nigel Godrich's one mix on here, Uneventful Days. So here's a little bit of the song Star, not mixed by Nigel Godrich off of 2019's Hyperspace.
Get knocked down by a falling star. Set you straight before you hurt yourself somewhere. Sinking like a stone up into midair. She's working out the meaning of the game.
Cool. Now let's hear Nigel's mix. I mean, already, through the first second, how much bigger this is. Not just in level, but also in frequency balance and width and depth. So much less one-dimensional. And you can hear one of those signature really long reverbs on Nigel's snare on this track. Would you even call that a snare? But it's delayed, heavily EQ'd reverb. Again, don't be afraid to have a reverb that has a totally different frequency balance than your original source sound and occurs totally differently in time.
Uneventful days, uneventful nights.
So much more compression on the vocal, but it's more powerful sounding.
Living in the dark, waiting for the light.
There's a little bit of auto-tune.
Never-ending battle lines. Everything has changed, nothing it feels right. No, I know, I know, I know, I know it's gone. I know, no, I know it's gone. Yeah.
Compared to,
She's working out the meaning of the game.
I mean, by comparison, this mix sounds mono, right?
But the tides have turned reflection of a face. Days and days I'm faced with so amazed. I take myself down the Georgia maze. She's got the corner, she's ringing the bell, holding on to herself. She's got the
compared to
From my world without you, no. I don't wanna hurt you. No. Gonna leave me alone. Uneventful.
that particular section is probably the most limited section in the whole song, but it's elegantly limited. Here's it a little further back, a little quieter with a little more space.
Oh, no, I know it's gone, yeah.
Compared again with another song that Nigel didn't mix off the same record. Much more pinched mid-range. Now there's width here, very hard pan delay, but it doesn't sound as wide as Nigel's stuff because it's the same sound left and right and center. You have the same sound happening left, right, and center. So it's very wide without making us notice that it's really wide.
When the sky fades out and the roads all end,
So much crunchier, more mid-range, right?
gonna wait on you. When the money runs out and the walls close in, I'm gonna wait on you. Gonna wait on you.
And to me, like, the acoustic guitar is in the same plane as everything else. There's width here, but it's inoffensive width. And the mix isn't bad by any stretch. It's just not as three-dimensional. Compared to Now, granted, it's easier to get this bigger, wider, taller, deeper sound when you're dealing with more sampled instruments, which is what's happening here. And every once in a while, you know, Nigel on something with less processed instruments, like that U2 track, isn't able to shine as much as he is on some of this material. But I would put Nigel in a similar camp with Chad Blake and Serban Ghenea. Chad Blake and Serban Ghenea are two other folks that we've covered in this series that have those kinds of mixes that mixers love, that are just impressive, deep, tall, wide, smooth. And I think Nigel, like Chad, leans more towards, let's make some things surprising, in your face, and almost too loud. Like, let's make featured elements almost too featured. I think Nigel, and to a slightly lesser degree, Chad, are like that, where Serban Ghenea has this kind of smooth vibe, but he's so smooth, he wouldn't be kind of offensive and risky in the same way that Nigel or Chad would be. But these mostly come from big, broad choices in volume, panning, reverbs, EQing your reverbs and adding delay to them, and lots of limiting. There's plenty of limiting and bus compression happening in these. Let's listen to one more album. This is taking it back further, again, back in time. So it won't be quite as contemporary as some of these others. This is 1998 again, REM, the record Up, where this is again kind of bridging the gap between the earlier 90s style of production and the more hyped up and amped up production style that becomes more prevalent after the year 2000. So here's a one that he did not mix called At My Most Beautiful. It's just not very exciting sounding. Now there's a volume difference here, that's part of it, but still.
I found a way to make you. I found a way.
let's compare that to, I think, one of the better REM mixes, Day Sleeper, which was mixed by Nigel Godrich. Here we go. Totally different right off the bat, right? Lots of compression on that guitar.
Receiving department, 3 a.m.
The vocals surprisingly quiet.
Socked up the overage. Directives are posted, no callbacks, complaints. Everywhere is calm. Hong Kong is present. Taipei awakes all talk of circadian rhythm. I see today with the newsprint gray, my night is colored. Headache gray, day sleeper. Day sleeper. Day sleeper.
Now you have to take this thing in its time and its context. For 1998, that is a really big sounding track. And there's also this kind of unfairness where I don't have volume normalization on. So both these tracks sound a little bit quieter than some of the more modern tracks that we were listening to. But I think if we listen to those two back to back and just take a little snippet of At My Most Beautiful.
Listen carefully to awkward rhymes.
Even a more dense section. Compared to a denser section of Day Sleeper. Here.
Newsprint gray, my night is colored. Headache gray, don't wake me so much.
And you can hear a hint of this in 1998, what records are going to sound like 5 and 6 years from now. Man, there's so much other stuff we could listen to. I might stop it here and just give you some recommended listening, or maybe we'll just listen to a few moments of some of my favorite tracks. There's so much good stuff that he's done. I think the French band Air, you've got to hear. I have Air tracks like on my reference playlist that I take, and I always, every pair of headphones I listen to, speakers, new speakers I audition, new places I go. I have a few Air tracks on there, a few tracks off of C Chain. So there's a bunch of Nigel Godrich stuff that I regularly reference. Here's just some quick moments. A Cherry Blossom Girl off the record Talkie Walkie. This is a Nigel Godrich mix. And this again was one of these things that was a revelation when I first heard it. This record I don't love as much as some of their prior records, but the production aesthetic on it when I first heard it was this kind of revelation where things were jumping up so much closer and so much more forward compared to a prior record of theirs like Moon Safari. And again, you can hear this thing he does where he has these really bright but controlled acoustic guitars. He's using a lot of fast attack compression on acoustic guitars. So the transients are really kind of squashed on them, but they're still bright and clear and detailed. And there's still a bunch of attack getting through. I wonder if he's doing the thing that I often recommend, which is a whole bunch of fast attack compression to really control the transient, or limiting on the instrument to control the transient, and then a little bit of slower attack compression to take this now more compressed and controlled transient and bring it up, because the guitars don't sound dull and squashed. They still have this kind of clarity and punch about them, but without having this deranged, spiky sounding attack that so many amateurs acoustic guitars have in their mixes. And then the vocal sound here, completely different tonal balance and texture than the acoustic guitars. And this is something we hear all over his mixes. It's almost like it's a fairly bright vocal, but funneled into such a dark reverb that the dark reverb is giving all the vocal its body rather than actual lower mid-range in the vocal itself. It sounds like most of the lower mid-range is coming from the reverb on the vocal. And again, just a totally different feel. This juxtaposition he's always doing between acoustic guitar and vocal. Big. Ooh, we got to get into these wide vocals here. Listen to that flute. It's so deranged. I mean, listen to how dark the reverb is on this flute. It's totally different than any of the other reverbs on the other instruments. Listen to it one more time. And the juxtaposition he puts into these mixes, you're going to hear this flute and its reverb are panned hard right for you and are very dark. But then panned hard left is this kind of clavinet-y sounding keyboard sound, like a percussive stringy sounding, stringy strings in the sense that like a clavinet has like guitar picks in it, that kind of thing. So we have panned to our right, this super dark, super distant flute that you almost have, again, the dry sound of the flute with its shadow that has this huge dark shadow reverb on it to your right. And then to your left, this more up close, this more right, very left panned, kind of choppy percussive keyboard. Listen to the dichotomy. Those two instruments enter together. In hindsight, that's not a clavinet. It's more like a just percussive synth pad, not even percussive, but a tight, short synth pad. I gotta listen to that transition one more time from our mono vocal that has this one type of dark reverb on it to we now go to the stereo vocal that doesn't have that same kind of darkness and depth to it, to then these two new stereo elements left and right playing off of each other. So there's always something new to listen to in the left-right field. And you could focus on either of those things. Another great air mix, Mer du Japon. I guess this means the Japanese Sea in French, off of Pocket Symphony. A little bit of a tighter aesthetic. This is what the 1970s German krautrock band Neu wish they sounded like. If you've ever heard, if you're into music production, you got to get to know the literature of recorded music that's been out there. You got to listen to the 1970s krautrock band Neu, Neu, double exclamation point, Neu. That's basically what this song is based on. But the production is so much different. Like there's no compression and limiting happening back then. And this is just so tight from the compression and limiting kind of standards we have today, but it doesn't sound over compressed and lifeless. The compression and limiting he's using here is giving it more life and more density, more coherence, more groove. Ooh, listen how muffled and dry that snare is. That is intense compression on those keyboard hits. You only get that sound off of intense compression. It sounds to me like slow attack, fast release, where there's this like sucking kind of sound on those piano hits. Not as loud as some of Nigel Godrich's mixes, even though there's significant compression limiting here. This is something that demands to be cranked. Like you want to turn the level up on this song. All right. Before I get too carried away, one more. I'm going to play for you guys one of my favorite references. Literally every single pair of speakers that I ever listened to to audition, or every single pair of headphones I test, I listen to this song on them. Paper Tiger. This is another Nigel Godrich production and mix. Just absolutely one of the most masterful pieces of music production I've heard, my humble opinion. I was encouraged to use this as a reference when I heard my good friend Mark Allen Goodman playing it at his studio Strange Weather in Brooklyn, and I heard it through his speakers, and I was like, whoa, I finally get the album Sea Change and why people like it. Up until then, I was like, I like Beck, but I really only like Mellow Gold, Odelay, One Foot in the Grave. Everything after Odelay is kind of like meh. But after hearing the song, I was like, oh, no, there's some brilliant stuff happening on Sea Change, and this is an example. Ooh. Just that first fill, like I've heard that fill on every system, and it never gets old. Just the left to right on that, the resonance on it. Oh man.
Just like a paper tiger, torn apart by idle hands.
Such a dry vocal, so dry so far, but there's still a sense of natural space happening, right? We set up the feeling of space, particularly with that drum fill.
Through the helter-skelter morning,
that guitar to your right?
Fix yourself while you still can.
Now I'm hearing more reverb on the vocal than before.
No more ashes to ashes.
Those strings and guitars, hard panning.
Cinders from the sky. And all the laws of creation.
Now, those left pan strings, I think that some of the reverb for them is spilling into the right. So it's maybe not a totally mono reverb. It might be a pan reverb. I could be wrong. We can ask Nigel Godrich. I could be imagining things, but it sounds to me like we got the strings hard panned and the reverb mostly panned, but not all the way panned. Let's back up just a tiny bit and see if I'm crazy or not.
No more cinders from the sky. And all the laws of creation.
Like the reverb is spilling to the other side of it, right?
Dead man how to die.
But not the dry sound. Yeah.
Deserts down below.
That bass.
And storms up above.
That bass player, that's got to be what, Justin Mendel Johnson, how do you say his name? I've seen him play live with Beck. He's just such a phenomenal bass player. But yeah, this is one example where, again, we have like a shadow of the strings. We have the strings, and then there's a shadow of the strings. The reverb is surprisingly long. It's kind of attached to the strings, and that's coming from generally the same location, but it's also detached from them in that it spills from one side out to the other. Now, I don't know if sometimes I'm saying right and left and I'm saying it wrong because I'm trying to imagine pointing to the correct side from your view. And then I might say right when I mean left because I'm trying to like juxtapose my hand positions in the right directions and can scramble my brain for those of you on the video version. You know what I'm talking about? But I would recommend listening to that whole song. Dude, there's a whole bunch more. The last quick ones we'll go through and then I'll take your questions, look at your comments, and we'll wrap it up for today. But here's one other off the album, Guero, that Nigel didn't mix. And then the only one that Nigel mixed on the album Guero is Girl. And all the other songs you'll hear on this record are so much darker sounding and so much more mid-rangey sounding and so much narrower sounding than Nigel's one mix on the album. Now, not every song necessarily needs this kind of really shiny, really big, really bold, Technicolor kind of presentation that Nigel does. And it's possibly better off that the album Odelay sounds the way that it does. And it's a more mid-rangey sounding album. And that it's, you know, inviting us in a little bit deeper rather than jumping out at us. And that's one of the things about all these Nigel mixes. The more and more he comes into his own, the more his mixes jump out at you. Like they leap out of the speakers at you. I find Chad Blake's mixes do that. They leap out of the speakers at you. Some of the songs on Guero don't do that. Some of the songs on Odelay don't do that. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad or worse. And sometimes things leaping out at you all the time could possibly get old. Maybe. And obviously the music is so much more important, even though there's so much that I'm just, you know, singing the praises of what Nigel does well, because I'm not going to do one of these and just crap on the guy the whole time. The music is so much more important because any day of the week, I would rather listen to Odelay than Mutations. Odelay is just a better album, has better songs on it. By the time Beck gets to the album Mutations, it just sounds like he's phoning it in with all these, here's my weird lyric stuff that I do. Yeah. You know, that was fine when you were younger. Maybe you should try to say something meaningful now. And I think Beck gets pissed off at himself at a certain point, right? And he does Midnight Vultures, which is like a caricature of himself where it's super dancey and super silly lyrics. And then he does these mopey records that he has Nigel Godrich produce, like Sea Change, and Mutation starts to go a little bit in that more mopey direction, and some others. But production aside, and not even production aside, I got to say, there's things about Tropicalia Mutations that are more impressive than anything on Odelay, but Odelay just has better music on it. Now, with Guero, could we also say that if every song sounded like Girl does, would the record get a little bit grating? Would it be too in your face? Would it be too engaging? Would it be too Technicolor all the time? And is it good sometimes to have slightly more understated and mid-rangey mixes? I don't know. You tell me. Here's a little bit of a song, one of the better and more popular songs that Nigel Godrich didn't mix, Go It Alone. Or at least it's one of the ones that's closer in tempo. And this has some of that Nigel Godrich with in it, with the claps, right? A little further ahead. This is not Nigel's mix.
Daddy was working, combed my hair back, stuck a match on the bathroom wall where my number is written, driving on the sidewalk, looking back at the sky is burning in my rear view. Na, 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 na. Go it alone. Na, 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 na.
This is that more Dust Brothers style of production, more mid-rangey, more saturated, more like brown sounding somehow. Versus, here's Girl, mixed by Nigel Godrich. Okay, it's already like higher up, like in register, but the brightness on it as well. Drier but deeper.
Yeah, I saw with the black tongue tied, wearing the roses, a fist pounding on a vending machine, a toy diamond ring stuck on a finger, with a noose she could hang from the sun, put it out with the dark sunglasses, walking crooked down the beach, she spits in the sand where the bones are bleaching, and I know I'm gonna steal her ride. Doesn't even know what's wrong, and I know I'm gonna make it right, and take her where it all belongs. I know I'm gonna steal her right, nothing that I wouldn't try. Hey, my son or girl. Hey, my son or girl. My son or girl. Hey.
Do you see what I mean about them leaping out a little bit more at you? And again, listen to the attack on this guy's acoustic guitars. I do really like the way Nigel Godrich mixes acoustic guitars. There's just something he does with the transient on them to keep them sounding punchy, but and they never sound over compressed, but he's just really controlling the initial impact so they never sound erratic or sloppy. So he's just brilliant at that. That's one trick I'd like to ask him, like, hey, Nigel, it sounds like you're doing the same thing on all your acoustic guitars. What is it? And it might just be limiting, like really fast limiting that's only hitting the peaks. It might not even be compression. I will have to ask Nigel one of these days if I get to meet him or talk to him. That would be absolutely lovely. Well, I think he's done great work here. Let me turn real quick to some of your comments that have come in live here. I had so much to get through. I didn't really end up taking a lot of questions on this one, but we did premiere this live, so it's only right that I go through some of these. Hey, we got Tanner here. We got Benj here. We got Glove Bunnies here. We got Robert Miller here. So many comments coming in the chat. Just remember, guys, that if you want to go super deep on this stuff on your own mixes, and you want to hear this kind of treatment on your own mixes, you got to check out great flowing courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They're guaranteed to change the way that you mix forever for the better. But if you want the deep listening on your specific mixes and specific feedback about exactly what you can do on your mixes to get closer to the sound of some of the sounds you really know, love, and admire, what better way to do it than go over to members.sonicscoop.com, become one of our members there. And we do regular mix feedback sessions where I'll sit down for an hour and a half, just like I did with you now, and go through your mixes and the mixes of other members and give you ideas about how you can reapproach your mix, what the lowest hanging fruit is, exactly what separates the sound of your mix from the sound of some of your favorite mixes. It is probably one of the best ways to get some real leapfrog moments in your mixing. Go over to members.sonicscoop.com to check out all of our great full-length courses, as well as becoming a member, submitting your own mixes, and get real-time, really supportive, constructive feedback on your mixes over at members.sonicscoop.com. Check out those great full-length courses. Again, back into your comments. So, Wonder Arp says much wider. Adam says percussion seems to have so much more air, space, and presence as compared to the sort of squished, sampled vibe on the kit of New Pollution. Just totally different. 100% agreed. Adam, you put it better than I can put myself, that they have air, space, and presence. Like things are more three-dimensional, more jumping out at you. The transients are so controlled, but also so pronounced at the same time. The attack is pronounced while the transients are controlled. There's this kind of brightness that he gets out of them without harshness. Man, it would be interesting to take some individual sampled snare hits and tom hits and kick hits and see exactly what the EQ profile is on them. I mean, I could kind of tell you what it is for any specific one, but it'd be cool maybe to see some of them together. That could be interesting. Paul says, great notes and discussion for this. Wonder Arp says the prior one was typical for the early to mid 90s sound. And yeah, things have really changed since the 90s. And sometimes when I get mastering clients and I ask them, hey, what are some of your favorite sounding records? And they give me a whole bunch of 90s records. I'm like, is this what you want your record to sound like? Like, is that really the direction you want to go? Or do you love those bands and you want it to sound like a contemporary record? Because those are two different things. And that's something I really encourage all of you guys to sort out in your own minds, is not just think about who your favorite musical inspirations are, but what records sound like today and how you want your records to fit into the library of recorded music today. And, you know, you might end up saying, no, I want this record to sound more understated, more relatively unprocessed compared to these contemporary records. That's the sound that I want. But you should know the difference between that early to mid 90s sound and the early to mid 2000 sound and the today sound, and boldly make a decision about, yes, wanting to go more in that direction. Wonder Arp says nothing in the middle. Yeah, in the beginning of one of those Radiohead tracks we played, there was literally nothing in the middle until the vocal came in. Like there was like there was the ride cymbal on one side, there was the side stick snare on another side, an odd percussion element going with it, and the other, and on the juxtaposing side there was this guitar, and literally nothing was in the middle until the vocal entered. I wanted to play that one because of how big of a difference it is. Ben says, man, some of his mixes are so much more dense, even in the minimal intro compared to the 90s mix. Absolutely. Mike says, Scoop, quick question. I bought the Sennheiser 490. Should I keep those or should I look at the Neumann one or the wooden ones you did a review of? Mike, I actually wrote back to you. Maybe it didn't get to your main, you wrote me an email about this, and I wrote back to you. So check your email. Maybe it didn't get to your primary inbox. So check that out. But the Sennheiser 490s are great. So are the Neumann, so are the Olos. In that email I sent back to you, I gave you my full tasting notes. And yes, you guys can email me, and I do try to answer. But if you really want guaranteed answers to me, because I don't answer everybody, I don't always have the time. If you want guaranteed answers, become a member over at members.sonicscoop.com, and I answer every single question in there within 24 to 48 hours in the member section. Thomas Fallow says, I was meditating the other day, clearing my mind a little, and then I listened to 15 Step, and I was blown away by the sound of the mix and just how interesting it all sounded. Yeah, Nigel definitely does interesting. Bradley says, hi, Justin. How do you get those guitars to breathe, sit up front, and have that texture? We're talking about the electrics or the acoustic? Let me know. Are you using a really upfront ambience with some pre-delay so the guitar is up front, but also has a pillow of room? Specify a little bit more. I do talk a lot about guitars here. He's definitely doing limiting on acoustic guitars, and he is getting brightness not from like excessive amounts of the extreme stuff way above 10K, but he's also but the guitars are also still bright and present. But it's more like upper mid-range to lower highs, and there is reverb around the guitars. Probably his shortest, brightest reverbs are on the acoustic guitars. And often on electric guitars are some of his darkest, fattest reverbs. And that's some of the choices that I've seen or heard Nigel making again and again across these mixes. Paul says, great mixes, a great analogy, verb as a shadow. Yes, absolutely. MyT88 says, David Bottrill and the Tool albums. Did Nigel do any Tool albums? I didn't come up in my searches. Oh, you're saying that this is David Bottrill who did the Tool albums. Yes. Yeah, it could be great to go into some of the Tool albums. And that's another band whose sound evolved over time and got progressively more modern. Rich Costi. I was thinking of doing Rich Costi, but then I saw he has something out with Mixed with the Masters recently. So I'm like, maybe I'll wait on Rich Costi. But I did do an episode, a whole podcast episode about one of the Audioslave albums that Rich Costi mixed. So if you want to really take a dive into some of Rich Costi's mixes, check out that one. I think it's called Perfect Rock Mixes or Ideal Rock Mixes, or you can search Audioslave, Justin Colletti, Audioslave, SonicScoop. Watch that video, listen to the sounds in there, and I give you a lot of my commentary on exactly what Rich Costi is doing in his mixes. So definitely have to listen for that. Dave Fridman. Yes, I would love to do one of these on Dave Fridman. He was definitely an inspiration to me and another guy who does interesting mixes. Thomas says, whoa, never heard this version. I grew up listening to All You Can't Leave Behind. It's like a different song. Yeah, isn't it amazing? The U2 song he's talking about, the mix from Nigel, the biggest differences are level differences and slight differences in the amount of high end on drums and the high end on guitars. Like he has darker cymbals and darker guitars. But the biggest thing is like how much louder he mixes the vocal, how much louder he mixes the guitars. And then he also compresses the vocal better, and I think controls the EQ balance in the vocal a little bit better. We don't get this chesty buildup around 200, 250 hertz. I don't really love either mix, and to be honest, I'm not a huge U2 fan, although I have tremendous respect. I think Streets Have No Name, Where the Streets Have No Name, is a gorgeous song. But I felt like both of those mixes left me wanting a little bit more, and I feel like if they were mixed today, they could be even better than they were. And sometimes it's not fair to compare stuff from the late 90s, early 2000s to stuff that it's from 2005 and 2015. Because the amount of compression and limiting on things on later records and the quick sip test makes the records that leap out at you and have this more dynamic consistency and more level and more brightness and more bombast on the bottom, just makes them sound more impressive in a quick sip test. But what sounds better to you over a full-length listen? And that's the thing with a record like Odelay, even though it isn't as hi-fi as any of Beck's records with Nigel Godrich, it's such an eminently listenable album. And once you get drawn into it and once you get used to how it sounds, man, those differences in top end and width and depth like don't matter. What really matters is, did they accent the right things in the groove, which the Dust Brothers always friggin' do. Their mixes are absolutely brilliant, not in the sense of sounding like impressive chef's kiss, perfect tonal balance. No, their mixes are brilliant in that they don't care about hi-fi. They care about interesting. They care about groove. They care about the whole thing hanging together, the whole thing creating its own weird world. And they don't care what it has to sound like to get there. I could do one of these on the Dust Brothers. Wonder Arp says, I think Jason Faulkner did a Beck album, underrated artist producer. Oh, I'd love to check it out. I know he did one recently, Colors. Was it the most recent one? Or that's the second most recent one. Robert Miller, how is he EQing vocals? I guess it depends on the track. In that particular Bono one, he's cutting more in the kind of 100 to 250 hertz region and then adding more compression. And maybe there's multiband compression on it. I don't know for sure. But much better vocal sound. Robert Miller says, I'd love a deep dive, full focus on how he uses EQ across the entire mix, but especially Vox and drums. That is probably going to vary from song to song. I've given you some ideas around there. And I think that rather than only speaking generalities, like looking at a specific song is a big way to learn. Like what makes the snare drum sound the way it does on this song? And then you categorize in your head, oh, that kind of snare drum, that direction of snare drum, here are the components that go into it. Because we heard many different types of snare drums on these songs. Now, there's one type of snare drum that comes up again and again on C Change, and I gave you some ideas about it. That probably condenser mic overhead, because you hear like some of the bottom rattle, but not in that like closed mic bottom rattle kind of way. That's my guess. And then there's some brightening on it, like 8K is probably boosted on the snare drum. But that's just one type of snare drum. There's other snare drums he has in here that are thicker or more muted or fatter. So you got to look at specific ones. Tanner says, wow, I never heard that Beck album. There's a lot of Beck albums and a lot of ones that I haven't listened to super extensively. I mean, the ones I grew up with were Mellow Gold, Odelay, One Foot in the Grave. Those are the ones I loved as a kid. And I have respect now for the Nigel Godrich ones that I didn't when I was younger. Paul Tedeschi says, now I know one of the main reasons why Air's Walkie Talkie was so good and such a delicious listen. Yeah, I'm a sucker still for Moon Safari, the very first album, and also the less well-produced soundtrack to, what the heck is that movie called? Oh, what's the movie called where all the girls off themselves? The Virgin Suicide soundtrack, something like that. Not as impressive sounding of a record, but it has a soft spot for me liking it back then. Although there were some dull moments on that soundtrack as well. Paul Tedeschi says, best YouTube mixing discussion I've had the good fortune of seeing, hearing. So good. Doesn't hurt that all the music is fantastic. Well, Paul, check out more of these. I got like 6 more in the series. They're all great. Tanner says, like Ben Folds 5 era, Ben Folds 5 is epic, says Thomas. Yeah, there's some Ben Folds mixes that are some of the ones that like, was it Brick was one that was like really big and was a kind of bridge into how later productions would sound. Paul says, huge mixes that I believe are not victims of massive mastering compression or to give the illusion of size. They are huge mixes, but I would say that there is substantial amounts of compression going on in the mix and in the master, but without detracting from size. But it might be less compression in some cases and more just limiting. Tom Mann says, Uneventful Days is mixed by Serban, not by Nigel. I don't think that's what I saw here. I was recently in Discogs where I was looking up who mixed what on that album. What the heck is that album called? Discogs. Beck. Or is it Wikipedia where I was looking it up? Darn. I'm going to take 1 second. Someone else look it up along with me. Uneventful Days off the album Hyperspace. I'm going to look up Hyperspace, Beck, and I think I either found on Wikipedia or Discogs. Let me double check. So mix. You're right. That one was mixed by Serban. Darn! I'll put a correction in the notes in the top comment. That one is mixed by Serban Ganea. I am so sorry. You're absolutely right. And that is the one error I have in here. I wonder if it was wrong on Discogs. At least this is what it says in Wikipedia. Now I want to double check the Hyperspace album in Discogs to see if that's where I saw it. There's a chance that I just made an error. That was one of the last ones that I grabbed. I honestly had never really listened to the Hyperspace record before doing this one. But I will definitely put that as a note if I find that to be true. Mix. Nigel. Darn it. Yep. Sorry, you're right. I made a mistake. It will not be my first, and it has not been my first, and it will not be my last mistake that I ever make. And I appreciate the correction, and I will add that. Okay. Next thing in here. Tanner says the bend is nuts. That driving bass is so sick. I wish I could control resonances like that, says Benj. I 100% know what you mean. Like, there's so much more evenness in some of the sounds that Nigel gets. Like, his acoustic guitar sounds and his bass sounds are always so well controlled. I think he's just not afraid of compression and limiting. And then he does things with EQ and adjusting release time to make it sound like it's not overly messed up. Glove Bunny Video says the chorus in Girl just jumps out of the mix. So cool. And it's true. This is a rare one where often in the very beginning of Nigel's mixes, he has something super wide happening. And this is one of the rare exceptions where he holds the super wide stuff until the chorus, and then it gets super wide. So if you actually compare back to back those two songs that I had in there for Beck off of that album, Guero, honestly, the song I have, Go It Alone, is one of the wider sounding ones on Guero, and it's wide from the beginning. So if you listen to just the beginning, you might be like, oh, well, Guero actually sounds wider than Girl. But once you get to the choruses in Girl, that's where the left-right stuff goes crazy. If you compare Girl to a lot of the other records on Guero, it will sound wider from the start, but it sounds super wide by the choruses. Robert Miller says his vocals even sound dry his vocals even dry sound very different from others. What's he doing there? That's a great question. So like on that Beck song, again, I think that a portion of this is just a like tasteful EQ, and I think there's substantial limiting on the vocal, a compression limiting on the vocal, at least dynamic control on the vocal. Like he's talking about something like the super dry vocal we hear on Paper Tiger. Let me play that for you. A little further back.
Torn apart by idle hands.
Like you hear how loud that S is at the end of hands. Like this is a vocal that has very little dynamic range in it. So I feel like there's limiting happening to make the vocal look really dynamically consistent, or fast attack compression. But then maybe there's also some slow attack compression that makes the initial detail, like the fricatives of his voice, very present. So there's this punchiness in almost everything that Nigel has. Like the electric guitar notes have this punchiness. The drums have this punchiness. And even the vocal has a punchiness in that there's a really well-controlled front-end attack that is prominent. And I think that only can come from multiple stages of compression or limiting, one which like shaves off the initial impact and makes it super consistent, and one that allows it to come through further. That's my guess. He might not think about it as consciously the way that I do, but that would be something that I would ask him about. And Nigel, if you watch this, I know Chad Blake watched his, and he wrote me an email giving positive feedback on, saying he'd be happy to come on and talk more about what he does one of these days. But yeah, that could be fun to have Nigel on this. I don't know if he does a lot of interviews, but I think if anyone can interview him, hopefully I can. Whether or not he likes to talk about the specifics of this stuff, I don't know, based on how relatively uninterviewed he is compared to some others. All right, Tanner says, okay, I'm an official member now. Awesome to have you, Tanner. Really excited that you'll be joining us over at members.sonicScoop.com. Thomas Fallow says, this has been great, Justin. Thanks for taking the time to do this. Excited for the next live stream. And Cold Acre says, Nigel is amazing. The sonic qualities of Kid A is remarkable, especially for its era, 1999 to 2000. Yeah, he was just so far ahead of his time, and I think so influential on other producers and engineers. Ben says, the second compression stage sounds late. Interesting. I'm not sure if I know exactly what you mean there. Let me know if you can add on to that. But I think we've got an hour 38 here. This is a good place to call it, a good place to end it. Thank you guys so much. Oh, he's saying 60 or 80 milliseconds or so. That's what I mean about slow attack compression being the second stage. Yeah, like I'm thinking that the first stage of compression or limiting is somewhere between 0 and 2 milliseconds. So like limiting or super fast compression. And then the second stage would be really slow attack compression, like 30 to 80 milliseconds. Yeah. And that allows that compressed attack to come back out. So really slow attack, yeah, at least 30 milliseconds and potentially 80 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. Yes, Bench, totally agree. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Well, thanks again for being here. Check out our full-length courses. They'll help you even more than this does, and I hope this has helped you some. Thank you so much. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Big shout out, and thanks to Sound Toys for being supporters of this podcast from the beginning. Check out their stuff at soundtoys.com, and don't forget to check out the full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs, etc. Check out the memberships at members.sonicscoop.com. It's been so much fun hanging out with you, and hope to hang out with you more there. Thanks again. It's been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.